This video is going to briefly go over the fire behavior fuel model selection cycle. This is a cycle that you wouldn't necessarily go through every time you're picking a fuel model, but if you're trying to solidify your selection, this is a nice way to guide you through that process. The first step is to gather all the possible fuel models that you would consider through these variety of methods that we'll look at briefly here in a moment. The next step is to narrow those options, then compare the fire behavior of the ones that you have narrowed down, and then select and evaluate and update based on what you are observing for fire behavior once you've applied fire to the ground. And then the cycle continues. So the first step is to look at a worksheet that we have to lay this out, where you could fill out each of these fuel models and each of these steps. This allows you to track the fuel models that you're considering as options and maybe go back to them if you see a need to do that. I've replicated that table in a Word document that you can access as part of the training on the Wildland Fire Learning Portal. Going first to the flow chart to gather our initial sweep of possible fuel models. If I'm burning in an area that is dominated by timber, there's some understory component, there's some litter component, and I expect moderate fire behavior, I have two of these categories that I would have fuel models that I'd consider, and I would put those into my table as options based on the flow chart. I would also look at burn plans or specialist reports or things that exist, and let's say in those reports I find that they have these fuel models as identified as possibilities. Thirdly, for gathering, I would go to Land Fire, and I can access the information from Land Fire from either the Land Fire website, where I can click on and off layers, navigate to my location, and use the Identify tool to see what fuel models it's calling my area. Land Fire will put in TL3. Notice every time I get a new fuel model that's not been listed yet, I put it off to the side. And if I get a confirmation of one, I put it into the same spot. Another way to view land fire data is on IFTDIS. You can run a landscape report. There's training on IFTDIS on the Wildland Fire Learning Portal as well. So for my area, the land fire information I can tell has not been updated based on harvesting that's happened. And so that means I take the information from Land Fire with a grain of salt. It's showing an SH2 in some of these areas, so I think it's worth considering SH2 as a possibility. And I'm going to exclude TL4 and TL5 because I believe that those are areas that have changed now since treatment. I could include those as an exploration, but for right now I'm going to leave them off. Next step would be to look at the characteristics of each of those fuel models that are showing as likelies. So we're going to pass by these dotted graphs for a moment and go to this table. And within the table, I'm prompted to look at both fuel loading and then my live herbaceous fuels. So for fuel loading, I am checking the loading of these different categories for 1, 10, 100, and then live and woody. And if I'm looking specifically at, let's compare grass shrubs for now. We've got a GS2 and an SH2 as possibilities. Ideally, I've measured some fuel characteristics on my site so that I know what is there, so that I can compare it to what the model says is there. These are important because when you are modeling your fire behavior, the more fuel loading that's in it in the model, the higher impact it's going to have on the output that you get. So for GS2, the fuel loading is a little bit light in my 1s and 10s, but pretty close. And for SH2, it's quite heavy. So I have too much fuel in SH2. Similarly, for my live woody, I am not seeing any of this much loading. So I'm going to say this is going to exclude SH2 for fuel loading and confirm GS2 as an option. So I would do that for the others as well, and I would show that TU2 is a good match for fuel loading. TL3 is too light, but is actually representing outside of my unit pretty well. TL8 looks good, and TU5 is too much. And live herbaceous fuels, these are important because the live herbaceous fuels, as those change, then as the fuel moisture changes in live herbaceous fuel, so does the fire behavior. So if I have live herbaceous fuels on my site, it's important that I also show them in my fuel models. So for example, TL8, my site has some grass on it, and TL8 doesn't have any live herbaceous fuels. It doesn't mean that TL8 is a bad choice. It just means that it's not the only choice that I have for my spot. I need something that represents my live herbaceous fuels so that as I model my fire behavior, those can be part of the equation. And the fuel models that I have in my options that have that live herbaceous are the GS fuel model has some. So that's a good mark there. And TU2, notice is a human climate fuel model, but it's might be something that represents my area well still, and it doesn't have that. So GS2 for right now is the only one that's representing that live herbaceous, which is the grass component that I do have on my site. So when I get to this point, I can pull down the fuel models that I think are going to be good fits. These fuel models, FM 10 and 9, these are of the original 13 fuel models, and they don't have a live herbaceous component, and I'm not sure if they're going to add something that the other fuel models don't already have. I could explore them, but those are meant for peak season conditions. So the ones that I'm going to go through my next analysis on are my TL8, GS2, TU2, and TL3. The comparison of those fuel models, it can happen in these dotted graphs. This allows you to compare fire behavior across and see different fuel models, but a way that I would prefer to do that when I have a computer in front of me is this tool here where I select the output that I want. We'll go with flame length, our tree cover, and our moisture condition, and I'll put in all my fuel models. With all of my compared models in here, I get to see what the fire behavior could be under different moisture conditions as well. So if I was planning for a variety of different conditions, I'm not just picking a fuel model for one burn. So how do these different fuel models react to different moisture conditions? Grass shrub is my most active fuel model for both rate of spread and flame length. TL3 feels like it might be underrepresenting fire behavior in my area. So I might remove TL3 as one of the fuel models that I'd be considering. Notice if I go and select that TU5 that showed up in some of the land fire information, it is showing higher fire behavior than I would expect to see in my area. Perhaps it's good to still plan for that, but if I plan for around TU5, I might not find myself a window to burn. So being realistic in what you're planning, but also if you are perhaps too restrictive. So this process can be somewhat unsatisfying. You don't end up with some magic number, but through the process of exploring these things, and I've done that, of course, quickly here, you are getting to know your area better. Ideally, what happens next is you are able to put well thought out fuel models in your burn plan, and then you observe, and then you go and you update based on what you've observed, and you continue that cycle of evaluation. This process does take time, but I find that as I go through it, I benefit greatly from the opportunity to gather information from the field and make sure that the fuel models that are in my plan, I feel confident about their appropriateness.